So I want to introduce our first guests who are going to focus their conversation on making the case for human rights and democracy in the MENA region. Our first guest is Dr. Ahmad, who we're so pleased to have here tonight. He's a board-certified physician, emergency physician, and board member for Med Global, a medical humanitarian NGO. Tahir traveled to Gaza on multiple trips, multiple medical missions, and since returning home to the U.S., he has spoken out about the dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza and made headlines when he walked out of a meeting with President Biden recently. Please, Tahir, welcome you to the stage. Joining Tahir tonight is Areej al-Sadhan. Areej is a Saudi-American human rights defender and sister of jailed humanitarian aid worker Abdulrahman al-Sadhan, who was forcibly disappeared in 2018 during a mass crackdown on critics and rights activists in Saudi Arabia. And he was sentenced to 20 years in jail and a 20-year travel ban in 2021. Areej has fought tirelessly for her brother's freedom and the freedom of all political prisoners in Saudi Arabia. Areej, thank you for being here tonight. And guiding our conversation tonight will be MEDC's Yasmin Omar, who's the director of our Democracy Matters initiative. Yasmin is an international human rights lawyer. She was a member of the Front to Defend Egyptian Protesters and a political activist in Egypt. She was forced to leave Egypt and live in exile here in the US after being targeted for her work, like many other Egyptian human rights lawyers. Before joining MEDC, Yasmin served as a consultant with the UN, a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and conflict. Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Arwa, for the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm Yasmin Omar. I'm a human rights lawyer and the director of the Democracy Matters initiative, and I am honored and privileged to be among you today and to be having this conversation with Areej and Tahir. Well, we are facing an inflecting point in history, like Tess said, and violent crackdowns have led to worsened authoritarian systems in the MENA region. And from this point, we are witnessing a human rights crisis unlike anything that we've witnessed before. In Egypt, human rights abuses have reached an unprecedented level in Egypt's modern history. In Tunis, Qais Said, the president, has been praising himself as an authoritarian monger leader. And in Morocco and Jordan, they have been quietly jailing and imprisoning their journalists and defenders. Moreover, on the Gulf, in the UAE, has been conducting mass secret trials. In Saudi Arabia, there has been an increasing lengthy sentences, prison, enforced disappearances, and security deals towards normalization. And eventually, we are seeing Kuwait dissolving its own parliament undemocratically. And on top of all this, a vicious war in Gaza, Israeli war in Gaza, unprecedented atrocities, and we are seeing a humanitarian catastrophe. These authoritarian regimes have only strengthened their positions through support, international support, including the US, or on top of it, the US. And eventually, these regimes are seeking security deals and security agreements to offer false promise for stability. Circumstances, of course, are bleak. So there is hope for human rights and democracy in the region, and what stands in the way of getting the US to be on top of prioritizing human rights and democracy for people in the Middle East and North Africa? I want to start by the three of us as example. Well, the three of us have ties, different ties to the MENA, and whether you're Egyptian, Saudi, Palestinian, American, doctor, lawyer, human rights defender, well, we're working on the ground or in the diaspora, we are sharing grief and we are in shock and uncertainty about the future. And from this point, I wanted to start by asking Thaer, you are a Palestinian-American with first-hand experience of what happened in Gaza. You've witnessed so many atrocities in Gaza yourself and victims. And you witnessed this knowing that the US is funding and supporting the war on Gaza. You have been trying to advocate against the war. You even walked out on a meeting with President Biden to send a message against the war. And I wanted to ask you, when in your work, when you're trying to convince stakeholders in the US, what is the biggest challenges you've been facing, and what is the responses you've been receiving?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Thank MEDC for having this event and allowing me the opportunity to speak. You know, I think I've been doing this actually since October, where we've been trying to meet with different elected officials, people who have a say or have a seat at the table, that we like to say. And having gone to Gaza in January, being at Nasser Hospital and watching Nasser Hospital get surrounded and raided, and essentially the second largest hospital in Gaza become defunct because of the Israeli military operations there. I thought that an eyewitness testimony would make a difference, being able to come here and say, as an American, as somebody who was there, as somebody who was in danger and had a chance of also being killed like many of the Palestinian healthcare workers, I thought that there could be recognition of that. I think there's a few challenges. I think ultimately, one thing that I'd have to, and this is my opinion, of course, but there's this dehumanization of people in the Middle East, in North Africa, that's gone on for decades. And you hear it even from former Israeli prime ministers. Golda Meir said, there will be peace when they love their children more than they hate us. There's this idea when you think of a Palestinian man, the idea that they're more likely to be a terrorist who's salivating. And I see that penetrating the psyche of lawmakers and policymakers here in the United States. Yes, it's wrong. A hospital being bombed is wrong. A doctor being killed. An ambulance driver trying to save Hind in North Gaza while she's on the phone with a dispatcher for 5 hours is somehow there's a justification for that. I have to ask myself, if this was happening somewhere else, not in the MENA region, would it be that same sort of rationalization? I mean, the blatant hypocrisy that exists between the policies and the way that we respond to Ukraine and to things like Gaza speaks for itself. It's the fact that this region, for whatever reason, it's okay for children to be killed in this manner. There's some sort of rationalization. It's sad, it breaks our hearts. But is it gonna change anything on the ground? We haven't seen that. 8 months of the most horrific humanitarian catastrophe since World War II. How has that not changed policy? How have we not realized that the admin before this one helped lay the groundwork for October 7th, and then this current admin has supported the ongoing aggression against the people of Gaza? So for me, I think part of it is that there isn't a recognition that the people in the Middle East are just like the people in the United States or in Europe. And then the second part of this also is that there is this counter narrative that's not being dispelled. So not as human as the rest of us, but also here's the story on the ground. Here's the explanation for everything.
Thank you, Thaer. And from your words, people matter in the MENA, whether it's in Palestine or Saudi Arabia or in Egypt. But our leaders are acting like we don't matter, and probably that's what encouraged other international forces to think that we don't matter as well. And from the point you've mentioned, I wanted to ask Areej, because Areej, your brother, was arrested and forcibly disappeared in 2018 over satirical tweets. And you have been a vocal advocate for him and other prisoners, deciding that the only option you had was to speak out publicly despite the risk and attacks and threats you've been receiving. Well, during this time, there have also been a lot of major developments in Saudi Arabia and in the world, and changes in regards to US policy, specifically towards Saudi Arabia. What changes that you have seen recently in the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, and how was the US response? Where are we now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. First of all, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to everyone who actually is here. It's very dear to me to be here to celebrate this very special event. Yes, to answer your question, how is the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia? Unfortunately, it has been deteriorating and getting worse every day. Every day there are cases of enforced disappearances. We've never seen deterioration like this before. Cases of lengthy draconian sentences and cases of torture, people being tortured in prison, women being harassed, raped in prison. It's just unbelievable and heartbreaking. My brother's story is probably one, and this is how I actually got to learn about all the other cases. At the beginning, we were lost. We didn't know what's going on. But then I started to learn about other cases and realized there's a pattern, actually. It's not just my brother's case. And Saudi Arabia today is not like Saudi Arabia before. Not to say that Saudi Arabia is getting better. Unfortunately, it's getting a lot worse when it comes to human rights. And what is changing is that Saudi Arabia today is actually sport washing, is becoming more expert in sport washing. Using PR campaign, buying sports stars and movie stars to actually promote their image and whitewash MBS's image especially after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So unfortunately, the situation in Saudi Arabia haven't got any better, especially when it comes to human rights. It's got a lot worse. I am a living testimony. My brother has been disappeared now for over 6 years. I haven't spoken to my brother or seen him for over 6 years. And since his sentencing in 2021, he is completely, disappeared. We're denied any communication with him.
I'm so sorry to hear this, Areej, and we all here feel for you and for your family. And from what you're saying that it got worse recently, I agree with you, because since the war on Gaza, we have been seeing increasing international indifference towards rising authoritarianism in the MENA, and therefore we have been witnessing new phenomena of human rights violations, such as those you mentioned. More importantly, like in November, Saudi Arabia executed 82 Saudis just in 1 day, because who cares? No one is going to ask. So I wanted to ask you both questions, given your capacity as Arab Americans, Saudi American, Palestinian-American. Well, how do you see the attacks on rights and freedoms in the MENA, and how it's implicating freedoms and human rights here in the US? Let's start by Thaer.
Yeah, I would say that the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law in Gaza, for example, and even in the West Bank, the curbing of rights, the restrictions that you're seeing, it's establishing a dangerous precedent. It's going without any sort of accountability. The fact that the hospital healthcare system was specifically targeted in Gaza, the fact that you have over 400 healthcare workers that have been killed, over 200 who have been detained, who have been abducted, I want to use that word. We're talking about a deliberate attempt to level an entire place, to make sure that people either leave the Gaza Strip or that they don't exist. And the fact that there is no accountability for that is establishing a dangerous precedent. I will remind everybody what happened in France a couple of days ago. We are watching the rise of more authoritarian, far-right groups coming to power, and that's going to cause irreversible effects for the generations to come. The fact that Gaza seems so far away, but to watch, and I will use quotes, a Western democracy carry out the atrocities that it's carrying out in the Gaza Strip with absolutely no consequences, to me, it's establishing an incredibly dangerous precedent. I am very concerned, not just about the future of MENA. I'm concerned about the future of the globe. This is having implications everywhere. And I'm reminded of people in Gaza when I was there, they don't refer to the West as the West anymore. They refer to it as the hypocritical world, al-alam al-munafiq. That's the way they refer to it now. It's not the West. It's not where Western values and democracy is being promoted. It's the hypocritical world. You will apply standards to some areas, but not in others. And I think that's going to be detrimental, not just to the US's interests, their strategic interests in the world, but to the future generations of the globe.
Thank you, Thaer. I wanted to ask you the same question, Areej.
Yeah, absolutely. It contributes a great deal to international repression. I've experienced that myself. So the more dictatorship can get away with human rights abuses, the more they are emboldened, and that means they can reach even international or cross borders repression. I've been threatened and I've been stalked and I've been actually intimidated by Saudi agents, whether online or in person. There have been 2 incidents where I was actually followed. So these are very serious. It brings these abuses here at home. It brings these abuses to Americans and to American soil. So it doesn't just stay there. Unfortunately, it's sad by itself that we have so many human rights abuses over there, and there isn't much influence that democratic countries or leaders can do to change the situation. But worse than that is actually coming here even to the democratic countries. So.
Well, we can't help but wonder what's standing in the way of getting the US government to prioritize human rights and democracy for the people in the region, knowing that it's implicating security here in the US, knowing that it's impacting the society here in the US. And like for you, Areej, you work with people to free your brother, you talk to people and you do a lot of efforts and still nothing changes. And for you, Thaer, you have been trying to advocate for the end and a ceasefire, an end of the war in Gaza. And I want to ask your opinion. What do you think standing in the way? Thaer first.
I think, obviously we're talking about U.S. foreign policy that's been in place for decades, for multiple administrations, doesn't matter red or blue, they have all kind of maintained similar policies. And I think it's the people. I think it's the way that they think and how they look at the region there. I've spoken to so many different people, and there's so many things that only so many stories that I can share. I can tell you all about Dunya Abu Muhsin, the 12-year-old who's in Nasser hospital. Her whole family gets killed. Her leg gets blown off. She miraculously survives, only to be killed by an Israeli tank shell 2 weeks later in the pediatric ward of Nasser hospital. I can only tell you about Salma, a 5-year-old girl who's walking. She was told, go to the south with your family, and she gets hit by a sniper. And her dad has to recount the story of she's jumping up and down, yelling in pain. I mean, everybody here can understand the kid jumping up and down, yelling in pain, but this kid is being killed in the process. It's not moving the people that we're talking to, the people who have been there forever. I mean, there are a lot of people who view the MENA world in the same lens as it was viewed post 9/11 as they do now 2024. And it's hard to change them. I don't know what else it's going to take, what sort of images you need to hear or see, or stories that you need to hear about. What are the facts? How many times does a Commission of Inquiry of Human Rights at the United Nations has to come up with some sort of report on this? How much more do we have to see to change? So I think it's the people that are in place now. That's the biggest challenge, because they're not getting it. I feel like they have to go, and there needs to be people who do get it in their place.
I can't agree more with you, honestly. Areej?
Yeah, I think what's in the way is, and also to recount what Maher mentioned, is also the U.S. foreign policy, as the way I see it, is outdated. It needs to be updated to the current and emerging issues that are happening, from increased authoritarianism and to increased human rights abuses. So, and besides, I think there should be more and more voices being heard from the ground of what's going on, rather than just just going by the old laws and rules. So yeah, I mean, I ask that question every day. Why? Why? It's so obvious. It's so out there. Why it's okay? Is it okay for these human rights abuses to be committed? Mm-hmm. For example, we've heard President Biden say that he's going to make human rights the center of his foreign policy. Then a few years later, that have changed. It's like completely abandoned. It's no longer the center of human rights. Human rights is no longer the center of foreign policy anymore.
Well, you started us thinking on what is wrong, and I wanted to use this moment, and because you're here in this position now, what do you say to the U.S. officials who say we have to make deals with authoritarian regimes to maintain stability, to make sure that there is no wars, there is no conflict? However, we always see wars and conflict. What do you say to them today?
Unfortunately, it's very disappointing to see human rights now is becoming nothing but transactional business. So when we say providing like military security guarantees to authoritarian regime, there's no way you can achieve human rights and stability in the region. It's the opposite. You can't have human rights while you're empowering dictators, while empowering people who are actually abusing human rights. So unfortunately, it goes it counter each other. It doesn't work. So if you want to have human rights and stability in the region, you gotta address the issues with this authoritarian regime. You gotta have them respect human rights and democracies that we claim to have before we can say we can bring stability and security in the region.
Absolutely. People think that democracy and human rights are separate things. We can pursue some developments on human rights. Hey, stop executing people, please, but continue to oppress them and not have fair elections and not have representative of all the nation. However, as you've said, I totally agree with you. We need to connect those together. There is no human rights without democracy. But I wanted to end by asking Thaer, when you walked out of the meeting with President Biden, you left with him a letter from an 8-year-old orphaned girl named Hadil in Rafah, begging for the president not to allow an invasion of Rafah. Now we're seeing what's going on in Rafah. Can you tell us how is Hadil? Is there any news?
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea. There are less, Rafah had 1.3, 1.4 million people before this invasion that apparently that has not crossed this red line that the Biden administration has set. And they have continued to herd the Palestinian people around like sheep in Gaza. Go south, go west, go Mawasi, go Khan Yunis. And so I don't know what's happened to her. And for me, after seeing the tent massacre, after seeing the UN shelter being bombed, after seeing Al-Aqsa hospital be threatened to evacuate, I'm very concerned about Hadil and the many children like her. I mean, this is a population that prior to the war, Save the Children has a report that said 4 out of 5 kids in Gaza, because of the trauma that they've experienced in the last 2 decades, are either self-harming or having suicidal thoughts. What about right now? What about the more than 1 million children who have not been in school for 8 months, whose campuses at the university campuses have been destroyed? What's happening to them? So I think about Hadil and many of the children that I got to interact with all the time. I mean, what's happening to them and how will they remember what's taken place over the last 8 months? And if I can just make one point about what you just said, US officials need to understand you use the word transactional, I think that's an excellent word. What you're doing is you are attacking the agency of the people in MENA. You are sidelining them. You're putting them to the side. They have no say, they have no voice. You're not just empowering authoritarian regimes and bringing stability. You're silencing these people. And now nobody has to think about them when they're making decisions. Nobody has to care what happens to them. And make no mistake, this is something that is not isolated incidents. Your brother is not an isolated incident. Al-Ma'madani Hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, Nasser, they're not isolated incidents. These are all compounding on top of each other. And we will have to reckon with what we've created as a result of all of this.
Well, it can't end more strongly. You left us with images that move stone and hearts. I am, and everyone else in the room, in awe of your activism and advocacy. Please continue to do so and know that there is a whole community that supports you. Thank you so much.